So really, the talks focus around a very particular subject, and that is happiness for the human being in daily living. And so if that's the topic, it requires a little bit of defining what is this happiness for the human being. And as we become clearer on what the happiness is, it becomes more obvious what the obstacle to happiness is. And given that happiness turns out to be the absence of the obstacle, it's pretty important to understand the obstacle and the dynamics that keep that obstacle in place. So it turns out that happiness for the human being is peace of mind. That's the form in which we can be happy on a continuous, unbroken basis in this life, through being at peace with ourself and the other, regardless of the circumstance we find ourselves in. So really, we're looking for happiness in daily living, happiness in life. And when we look at what life is, see, life is interhuman relationship. So really, we're looking for happiness, which turns out to be peace in life, meaning peace in interhuman relationship. Peace and harmony in interhuman relationship. And as I was saying, the peace is not, and the harmony is not really a gaining of anything. It's not something added in to a relationship, which is what we tend to be seeking in life most regularly, is we're trying to add in things to make things better. Whereas the paradox or irony of this whole search is that it isn't about adding something. And that's one of the main reasons why humanity has been seeking for so long, and by and large not becoming satisfied as a result of the seeking, because the seeking is a particular type of seeking that's happening. I'm not necessarily talking about spiritual seeking, but the same principle applies in spiritual seeking until it becomes clear that the same error essentially has been carried over into the spiritual seeking. And so by and large, the human being has evolved to a point where the assumption is, in order for life to be better, I need to add things that I don't have into my life. So essentially seeking happiness in the form of pleasure or in the form of changed circumstance. That's the standard given assumption. And these are descriptions. So what I'm saying is, it's not really an opinion. We can treat it as an opinion, but what I mean by that is, if you take the concepts and hear what they're saying, then you get to check it out, especially for yourself. That's the most important thing. So this statement is essentially saying that life has developed us to a point where we are convinced that our happiness is to be found in adding more into our life. More pleasure, essentially, change of circumstance. And that's an error. So that's just a description. It's not a judgment. It's a description, and then hopefully we get to see, is it true that that's my deeply ingrained idea of where happiness is to be found? Now, on a conscious level, we might have started to understand, no, that's not where happiness is to be found. But if we ask ourselves this question really honestly, we need to look at all levels. And if we find that on one level we understand it's not to be found in outcomes, and yet when the body is allowed to just, and the body and the mind is allowed to roam unchecked, and we see it continually going back to imagination, a fantasy of things being different, that's a great observation. It means we've become honest and we've seen things below our concept of various things. So the concept and the conviction to some extent that no, my happiness isn't to be found in outcomes, that sinking in is very positive. But if we don't recognize that the opposite is still in place in the system, then we might become convinced that, no, I understand that my happiness isn't to be found in circumstance. When we look more closely, we say, oh, actually on some level I understand it. And on some level I'm moving away from seeking happiness in the form of pleasures and new circumstances. But I acknowledge that on another level, when things are left unchecked, automatically there's a thinking process and a movement and a yearning for improved circumstance. Like, for example, the yearning to meet our soulmate, let's say if we're single, or if we're in a relationship, the yearning for the relationship to be more fulfilling, let's say. And when we land on this and say, wow, yes, there is this deeply ingrained assumption that when that happens, everything will be better or everything will be okay. That's a great insight to have. Because then we're seeing what the concepts are saying for ourselves, for our own situation, which means the further collapse of that structure. Once it's seen and once it's understood to not be a movement that will deliver what we think it will deliver. So the one of the concepts in the teaching says the human being, generally speaking, is seeking because of a deeply ingrained belief that says my happiness is to be found in outcomes, my completeness is to be found in outcomes, is seeking happiness in the form of pleasure, 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 new circumstance, changed circumstance. That's the concept. And then it says, actually, for as long as that seeking continues, we're looking for something in the wrong place. And we're not going to find it there. It just isn't there to be found, and yet we keep looking, hoping that it, if I turn over one more rock, I'll find it there. But the rocks are all in a place where the thing we're looking for just isn't. So it doesn't matter how many rocks you turn over, it's not going to be there. So the concept says actually the happiness that is available for the human being is not a happiness through outcomes, that's pleasure. And pleasure is great, don't get me wrong. I'm not suggesting that we should reduce pleasure down to an insignificance. What I'm saying is we should start relating to the flow of life, both pleasure and pain, in a healthy way, relating to circumstance as pleasure and pain, knowing that pleasure and pain isn't actually an attack on who I am or an addition to who I am, that it's not going to make me more complete or less complete. And to remember that my happiness is a happiness of peace. Now we're getting to the peace. What is peace? Peace is the absence, not the addition, the absence of suffering. And suffering is that which is, in practical terms, arises as guilt, blame, pride, worry and anxiety, expectation and attachment to outcomes. So they're all really mental and attitudinal movements. So guilt isn't a circumstantial thing. It's a feeling and a thought pattern that arises in our experience. It has a certain quality to it. The quality is one of uncomfortableness with oneself, primarily oneself when it comes to guilt, for not being good enough, not having performed well enough, being inadequate. And so self-pity, someone asked about self-pity in a question the other day, self-pity comes under guilt. And lack of self-confidence and unworthiness fall under this category of guilt. I'm not good enough the way I am. I need to essentially improve myself. I need to become better, more. I need to add more to myself. I need to get bigger muscles, or better haircut, or become more intelligent, become more social, become more financially successful. So all of these movements in life are linked to either a sense of not being good enough, or an idea that my happiness, my completeness, is to be found in getting pleasure. So we figure if I become a better human being, I will get more from society. And so we're seeking this more. So the forms of suffering, guilt, blame, pride, worry and anxiety, expectation and attachment to outcome, are not actually circumstantial, but they're all thought and feelings about a circumstance, about life as it is right now, or life as it was in the past, events that happened in the past. So an attitude towards what the other did that hurt me, for example. And that's the attitude of blame. It's blame if you have a certain attitude to what the person did that hurt you. If the attitude is you as a separate, independent doer, you as a separate individual delivered pain to me, and if we believe that pain is an attack on what we're looking for, then we feel that pain not only on a biological level, but at a much deeper level. It creates an uncomfortableness with ourself on a deep level, and then we say, you hurt me, you attacked me, so I hate you. And that becomes the attitude of blame towards the other, based on a circumstance that happened. And this attitude of the arising of blame and guilt and pride, worry, worry and anxiety, expectation and attachment to outcomes, carries on in horizontal time. That's the really unfortunate part of this form of suffering, is that it's not momentary, but it gets dragged out over time. Sometimes a whole lifetime. A whole lifetime of bitterness because of what someone did 60 years ago. And the reason that it doesn't fall away is because it's kept in place by a very important assumption. The assumption we've been talking about, that circumstance, which is either pleasure or pain, and usually it's got to do with painful circumstances. The assumption that circumstance was an attack on who I am. So once that assumption is locked away in the in our attitudinal relationship to the event, it essentially means that it's personal. It's about my survival. It's about my completeness. And so we can't drop it. It's not about, well, just work hard at dropping it. It's not. It is. It's just a dynamic that can't happen. It will get dropped very quickly, effortlessly, once it's seen in a different light. Once it's seen to not be personal. Because once it's not personal, like, who cares that happened? Like, really, like, I don't, so what? But when it's taken personally, if someone tells you, no, just drop it, it's like, you can't. It's like, I can't drop it. If I drop it, it's almost like, it's disrespecting myself, but on a much more fundamental level of survival and existence is what it would be like. It would almost be like dropping it is the equivalent of getting a knife and stabbing yourself. It's like, I can't drop it because that was an attack on myself. I have to defend myself against that. So psychologically, it gets carried on and on and on and on until either because of time it gets forgotten, which is unlikely if it's something that has been taken very personally, and the intensity of the pain is what tends to be linked to how personally we take something. And so this is a key to the events of the past falling away. And so what I mean by the past is a minute ago as well, 10 seconds ago. So if someone, says something that's, let's say, rude or an attack, and then afterwards they come back and they say, I'm sorry about that. It's like, oh, don't worry about it. That was a long time ago. It doesn't have to get carried on. It's like, oh, that happened. It's finished. And we can be like that if it's not personal. But you can't pretend it's not personal. It's not about it being personal because we choose it to be personal, or impersonal because we choose it. It's because of a certain dynamic, and we'll talk about that.
No, just responding to what you said about that it happened 30 seconds ago, or a minute ago, or a day ago, so you let it go. And because even if the person apologizes, and I can say that, don't worry about it, but there's a deep lack of trust that it won't happen again. So there's a sense of, I need to really be careful about this person. And there's already a mental check. Mm-hmm. So even though he apologizes, I see a wolf in sheep clothing. A wolf who's trying to be nice, but actually will do this again.
So I just used the example of someone apologizing. The point is that they don't even need to apologize if it's not personal. So,
but it will happen again.
Yeah, but even the fact it will happen again. Who cares?
And again,
because it's not personal. When it's taken as an attack on who we are, which is not, once again, it's not something that we can choose to, take it as an attack or not take it as an attack. Something fundamentally needs to change in our idea and connection to what we are. And so if it is taken personally because of our makeup, right, because of the way we relate to what the other person does, right, and how we see it in relation to our self-identity. So if it is taken personally, then we are going to become weary of the other and really weary of life. So this is where when pain in the moment from the other gets received and it's taken personally, then what happens is that creates an attitude of separation between you and the other, me and the other, whereby the other is a competitor at best, a rival, or an enemy. And so we go through life being fearful and suspicious, with our defenses up and our guard up all of the time. And that's not a criticism. What I'm saying is not a criticism or a judgment. It's just a description, right? So you might be able to relate to it. That we go through life suspicious of the other one hurting us, being able to hurt us at any point. So, what is it that changes in us that allows life and the flow of life, particularly painful circumstances, often delivered as a result of the actions of the other? What is it that prevents us from receiving that as an attack on who I am? Because it's not something that we do. If someone says, oh, I've heard that, so now I have to work very hard at not taking things personally. If nothing changes except for someone's intention, you can say that they've got a good intention and they might be able to hold up a facade for a period of time, that no, I'm not taking it personally, it's all okay, it's fine, you apologized, I accept your apology, thank you. And really what's happening is that the anger, the fear, or the blame, the fear, is building up. And we might be pretending that it's not personal, but it's still personal. So intention alone is nowhere near enough. What is required is a fundamental change that life will deliver. So this is what, when people refer to grace, grace really means that we're not the ones in control of life and what it delivers. So as you know, one of the key components of the teaching is the pointing to the fact that we're not the doers. So clearly things happen through us. You know, we make breakfast, we read books and write articles and have children. And so non-doership doesn't mean that things don't happen through us. It's pointing to the fact that what happens through us is essentially a result of how life has shaped us. And so the belief in doership or the belief in non-doership is simply a result of how we see ourselves. Do we see ourselves as the agent of everything that the body and the mind produce? Or do we know that what is happening through the body is essentially life functioning through a body that life itself has formed in order to function exactly that way? So clearly things are always happening in life. The body is always, on one level we can say, doing in terms of functioning. There is a functioning. But that functioning, when we look at it closely, is not a result of the body being in control, but rather as a result of the body functioning automatically according to its design. So whenever anything happens, especially those things that deliver significant change for the better, that's what's referred to as grace. It's like, thank you, thank you, life. I realize that I wasn't the one that brought about this change that has delivered this gift. So we refer to that as grace. So really, all of life is grace, meaning all of life is not my doing, but grace is reserved in a sense for those changes that we consciously see happened outside of our control and delivered fairly positive results. So what does life need to deliver? What is the grace that needs to be delivered in order for circumstance to not be taken personally? Essentially, it's a combination of the dissolving of the self-identity, the dissolving of the belief that what I am is primarily just a physical entity in control of everything that happens through me, and the co-arising belief that as this physical entity, my completion and my happiness is to be found in pleasure, 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 or the gaining of something, to be found in life being different to the way it is. So that essentially is a set of beliefs that are not in line with what we really are. So if those don't dissolve, we are going to continually find ourselves at odds with life that is flowing, and the flow of life is always a mix of pleasure and pain. And our self-identity says, I need life to deliver me all of the things that I believe will complete me. I need life to make everyone like me, everyone be kind to me, everyone do what I would like them to do, be kind to others. I need life to deliver financial security and great relationships, a great job, a Ferrari maybe. So that's the self-identity. It's actually a very deeply ingrained belief structure. That's what the self-identity is. And because it's essentially saying, it's demanding, it's insisting, because it thinks it's its survival. Not only survival, but it's its means to completion. When life delivers what it's always going to deliver, which is a mix of pleasure and pain, what is that to this self-identity? It's disappointment. It's an attack on what it believes it needs in order to be complete. So life essentially becomes an attack on what we believe ourselves to be. So if those beliefs don't weaken, start to dissolve, life is going to be taken personally. The counterpart to that is a connection, a realization of the part of the human being that's always been part of the human being, because it is part of the human being. Actually, it's what we could call the core of the human being. A realization of that, meaning a recognition of it, a seeing it, and therefore an appreciating of it, for sometimes the first time. So it's a dissolving, a weakening of the false belief of who I am, and a connecting to the core of what I am that has been obscured for a whole lifetime by this self-identity, which is essentially a set of inaccurate belief systems. And what the core of the human being happens to be, and if we were different, maybe this happiness, this peace wouldn't be available. But what we happen to be at our core is something outside of the dimension of time and space and matter. consciousness, we could call it, if we want to use a word for it. And the nature of consciousness isn't bound by the physical laws. So when we dive into or rest in our beingness, what we find is something quite different to what we know when we look outwardly. We find something that is timeless, meaning it actually doesn't contain any of the characteristics that the external world contains. And with the absence of all of these characteristics, we find that there's a mystery inside. But it's not a mystery that we need to solve, because what's there is a sense of being. So the core of what the human being is consciousness that already is in this moment. It exists. And we could call it I amness, I existness, I am completeness, because that happens to be the nature of it, because it doesn't include any thoughts to the contrary, and it just happens to be what it is. So the core of the human happens to be something that is complete right now, that is at peace right now. And so if the core of the human being is at peace right now, then that means the human being can be at peace right now. So it's a connection to the core of who we are that delivers recognition that I'm complete right now, even when life is not ideal according to certain standards. We drop into our being and we find our being is completely content and complete with life being exactly the way it is. We have to acknowledge the fact that the thinking mind, which is another term for this set of deeply ingrained beliefs about what we are and what we need from life, that is out of line with what we really are. We have to acknowledge that the thinking mind has an amazing capacity to obscure a connection to the core of what we are. Doesn't mean that we're not that at our core. It doesn't mean that we're not what we are, because we are. But when there is the presence of this thinking mind, it has the complete capacity to obscure a connection to the part of ourself that is at peace with things as they are. So this movement is fundamental. Hearing that what I am at my core, something that I can be, that I can know directly. It's not good enough. So hearing that what I am at my core is already complete and at peace, already happy with life, is possibly one of the most valuable bits of information that life can deliver to us. Because if we're lucky, that information, we'll hear it and we'll say, but that's not how I know myself. that's not my experience. And life, when it delivers the information, tends to be persistent enough that it says, yes, but I'm just letting you know that what you are at your core is complete right now. So be interested, maybe, in this part of yourself that we've lost connection to. Be interested to know it's there, or because you know it's there, well, at least in theory, then be interested about it. So I wouldn't suggest that we believe that the core of who we are is complete and at peace. But what I would suggest is it's like someone saying, hey, you know, your grandfather told me that he buried a treasure in the back of in the backyard, and he wanted you to know about it. Now, it might be a lie, but you'd be curious about it. So if you get enough hints from life, you bump into someone else who knew your grandfather, and they tell you the same thing, and they have a genuineness to them, let's say. And then life starts delivering this message to you in more and more ways, and starts conspiring to help you investigate what's in the back garden. Then the best way is to not get obsessed with finding the treasure, because it may not be there, and so that's not a great attitude, but just a curiosity. And the next biggest gift that life gives is a glimpse of the self, let's call it that, self with a capital S, the core of our being. And that glimpse is sort of like finding a gold coin when you're looking in the back garden and you find a gold coin. Now, you've been told that the treasure is not just a gold coin, but lots of gold coins. And say, but you find a gold coin, and now it starts giving you experiential proof that what has been spoken about may actually be here. Now I'm using an analogy about gold coins in the garden, which let's not get confused, because very easy. Remember, the human being is looking for happiness in the form of gold coins, pleasure, things to add to itself. So it's just an analogy. This is a search for something that hasn't actually ever been anywhere other than here. So it's not a search out there. And when we look at the process, because it is a process, it's just the process of unwrapping, of removing the obstacle. Which means we start bumping into this core of the human being when the obstacle, which is the thinking mind, stops functioning as relentlessly as it ordinarily does. And in my experience, there's process, in a way, a movement that needs to start happening. And that movement is a movement into presence, into the present moment, away from the thinking that is always looking for completion outside. So firstly, so if we listen to this whole talk, we're starting off saying that humans are looking for happiness outside. And that's part of the false belief system, which is part of the false identity. And happiness isn't ever to be found out there. Happiness is to be found in the form of peace of mind. And peace of mind is the falling away of the movement of looking for happiness out there and the movement of holding on to blame and guilt for the events that seem to have been a hindrance to attaining things out there. So events where people disrespected you, where people hurt you, was delivering pain to you, which is the opposite of what you're looking for. And when you acted a certain way that meant friends didn't want to be your friend anymore, we say, oh, that was, my action delivered an attack on myself, essentially, by sabotaging what I'm really looking for, which is more. And so we've got this pile of events in the past that we relate to as attacks on what we're looking for. So once we start to become clear that this is the dynamic, so remembering all of these descriptions, that's what they are, they're just descriptions, for us hopefully to recognize for ourselves, then a movement needs to start happening, which is a movement out of that thinking, which we might not even be aware of as a thought process, because when it's happening and there's complete involvement in it, it isn't even seen as something that isn't me. It's known to be what I am, so at first there's no space from it. It's like, well, I am that. How can I step away from it? How can I be anything other than, what are you talking about? It doesn't seem possible. And then quite a strange thing can happen where thoughts, the commentator in one's head, can become seen. And it's like, oh, wow, I didn't realize that there was all this noise happening in there, because there was complete involvement in it, oneness with it, you could say. And if a shift happens, we see this incessant stream of thinking. Now that shift tends to happen when the thinking has been spoken about, has been described, and once the working mind starts to receive the descriptions, which essentially is objectifying the thoughts. So the descriptions are labeling the thought. They're sort of turning it into an object. If I can talk about the thoughts, if I can say the thoughts are about the past, about the future, about seeing oneself as the doer of what has happened and seeing the other as the doer, and blaming oneself and saying I could have done it differently, and blaming the other and saying you should have done it differently. If we can start labeling those thoughts, essentially, whether we realize it or not, what's happening is they are being not turned into objects, because they always were objects, but our brain can now start redefining them. So it starts getting descriptions about the thoughts, and what's actually happening is that without us knowing it, an object which was never related to as an object, well, this is very important, an object that was considered to be the subject, because there was so much involvement with the objects of thought that it felt like that's what I am. And as we speak about thoughts, as we describe them, as we point at them, they're being objectified. The brain is starting to relate to them as objects just by thinking about them in a definable way. And at some point, the brain is able to become aware of the thoughts. When I say the brain, let's just call it a part of the human being is able to become and recognize another part of the human being that wasn't able to be seen before because there was no distance. It's very easy for us to see the chair because the brain has had an experience of the chair as an object. The inner movements, a very different relationship to them has happened automatically, where they're not seen as objects, they're seen as me. So the process of talking about the inner landscape is changing the brain's relationship to the outputs of the brain. And now there is the potential that those will be seen as objects. That's a very big shift. I would say it's a structural change that happens that allows thinking to be witnessed, whereas it wasn't able to be witnessed before. And the same can be said for emotions and feelings. As they're described and as we start relating to them and seeing them more and more, they become more and more known as objects rather than the subject. And why is that important? It's important because in order for us to know what we are at our core, a movement away from, or a reduction in the thinking mind thoughts needs to happen, and a movement into a different gear, let's say, or a different space, different place.
So Roger, I under the assumption that you are prone also to go down this rabbit hole of the thinking mind, what are the tools that occur to you to use to get yourself out of that rabbit hole, or abide in I am, or be in the present, or drop to the heart? Are there tools that occur to you to use?
So the process is a process of diminishing the thinking mind, which then means there's no need for a tool at that point when it's diminished. Because we find that we abide in I am, because it's our natural state. Once it's always been a natural state, once the layer that obscures it is dissolved, then we don't need any tools anymore. But and so my experience is that that process of getting caught in the thinking mind has stopped. Yeah. But your question is exactly in line with what we're talking about, is how does this movement happen from being obsessed, or not us being obsessed, but where the functioning of an incessant thinking mind to a movement into being more and more regularly, and eventually the cessation of the thinking mind. So your question is, what is the methodology, or what are some of the tools or some of the practices, essentially, that can aid that process? Now, the first part, what I've been talking about, is actually very much the first part of the process, which is to hear about everything we've been talking about, that there is a core of the human being that is right now at peace, and that it's covered up, and that it's covered up by the thinking. So that's a very important part. And it's, in a way, it's not something that we just hear once and then we move on to the next step. It's something that we really need to hear until we really get that message, right? Because that has to be the foundation of being interested in tools, for example. Because if you hear that and then you ask for the tools, but then the first part falls away, then there's no need for the tools, essentially. So the first part is to hear what I am at my core is already at peace. And it's a matter of the obstacle that gets in the way of that falling away. Then a movement of, well, hearing about what the different forms of the thinking mind are. So descriptions of the thinking mind, which then allows the working mind to see them in action. And that is where the thoughts are being now seen as objects, thoughts happening. So that's a very significant practice, in a sense. But these practices are not practices that you do for 2 hours a day. They're not even practices you have to, I'm not saying you have to commit to doing them for 10 hours a day, but it's a movement that will happen automatically once we've been exposed to certain information by life. So once life has exposed us and it become part of our system, we automatically will see the thoughts of the thinking mind, for example. We automatically will have the information that can distinguish guilt from blame, distinguish blame from pride, pride from anxiety and worry. So essentially the landscape, the inner landscape of the thinking mind starts to become much more well known compared to the jumble that it was before. And the jumble it was before meant not just a jumble of the thinking mind, but jumbled up with everything else. So being equipped with this information is the basis of the movement, or what you could call a practice, but it's an effortless practice. It might happen for many hours in a day. I found it happening in my dreams. So in dreams, if there was any suffering arising for the character in the dream, an investigation or a interest in that was happening in the dreams at night, which is simply a demonstration of how interested the system has become in seeing and understanding the thinking mind, only because the system has become very interested in remembering itself, or remembering the core of the human being. The practice, which also is effortless, of dropping into I amness or dropping into beingness, is what I would talk about next, is that there needs to be this interest in not in a way, not cooperating, or not cooperating is maybe a bit harsh, but no interest in buying into the thinking of the thinking mind that has now been seen to not be delivering what we truly are, but to be an obstacle to it. So whenever that's seen, a movement away from it, right? So let's say someone is dragging you into an argument, and you realize that as soon as you get into defending what the person is accusing you of, and this happens time and time again, you realize, actually, I'm just buying into it. So we might decide, we might find that, no, I'm not interested in trying to justify that, the person has their ideas, they're completely unfounded, let's say. They're based on error. And so I'm not even going to try and correct the error anymore. I've tried that and it doesn't work. So then there's this movement away where there's no engaging in it. And that's, once again, that's an analogy. And we have to come to something similar in relation to the thinking mind, where the thinking mind is seen, and then I'm got no interest in engaging in that. So what is the movement that doesn't engage in the thinking mind? And it's a movement into the present moment. That's where we really have to come into the present moment, because that's the only place we can rest indefinitely, is in presence. So if we try to not be interested in the thinking mind, but remain on the same level of thinking, or remain in the space of thinking, we can't remain there indefinitely. What that's the equivalent of is having your head on a certain level above, let's say above a board, and a gas gets pumped into the space. And the best we can do is like hold our breath, because we're still in that space, right? And you can only hold your breath for, let's say, a minute. So that's not a solution on an ongoing basis. What needs to happen is we need to find a new place to go to where we don't need to be holding our breath. So that means if you can find this movement where the head drops down, the person's head drops down below this board, so there's a hole in the board and the head's through, and then this gas starts coming in, and it's not a pleasant gas. And so instead of looking to hold our breath, we figure, I can drop down to another level. And you drop down to the other level. You don't need to hold your breath. You get to breathe normally because the gas isn't there. And if we don't know of this other gear, essentially, that we can shift into, what we might do is understand that, the thinking mind is a problem, and that there's myself that I'm not aware of, and that I need to disengage from the thinking mind. But we don't get given or learn about the place that we can go to where a disengaging happens. And so we end up still on that same level, where at best you can disengage just for an indefinite or for a very short period of time, and then you're back in the thinking mind again. So that's not the solution. Solution is to find a shift that allows us to shift out of the thinking, and that place is here in the present moment. which means attention has to come into the present moment. Attention has to really become aware of this. This as a creation. So this moment as an experience. If we relate to what's here as, some chairs and a couch and, some walls and a door, it's really uninteresting. That's not, surely that's not where I'm going to find myself. But this moment is something quite profound. And it doesn't necessarily present itself as very profound, because it presents itself on the surface as some chairs and a couch and a wall, a few walls and a door. And we've been exposed to that our whole life, and it's like nothing special. But that's not what this is. This is an experience. And the experience is changing you on a micro level every moment. The experience is continually changing. When we move from one place to the next place, it becomes obvious that the experience is different. So if you walk into a restaurant, and I'm using the words loosely here, because when we start to become aware of it as an experience, we realize, well, maybe the restaurant came into me rather than me walking into the restaurant. But for the ease of description, for first we say, well, when it appears like I move out of this room into another room, the experience changes. It's not the same experience. Right? If someone comes and puts their hand on your shoulder and starts massaging you, you could say, oh, the experience has changed. A minute ago or a second ago, I wasn't feeling pressure and it's painful or it's pleasurable, and then that's changed. The birds are always chirping differently, horns coming and going, people speaking, stopping speaking, music coming on and off, the song is changing. We look at it on a micro level, we find the whole experience is never the same. So Heraclitus had very profound sayings. You can't step into the same river twice. And what it's pointing at is that, we might say, oh, that's the River Nile. It's the same river. It's never the same river. What he's talking about is it's always in flux. If you take a photo of the river in this moment, it's completely different the next moment. And so these insights are very important for us to start relating to things differently. So this present moment experience is always changing. And where does it come from? Where does it arise? Where is this experience happening? Life has formed us in a way that gets us to relate to what's in front of us a very particular way. And that is that, well, this is an objective reality. And so, there's nothing special about the couch. It exists on Mother Earth in a particular house. So nothing really special about it. But if we start looking at it differently and we say, well, this moment is always it's an experience. We have an experience of the couch. There is an experience of a person. So I am in your experience. And the cars that go past are in your experience. They're not outside of your experience. So the present moment is always a momentary experience. And to be present with the experience as an experience means that we've there's a movement that has happened out of the level of thinking into the level of presence. And it's most helpful if we drop the idea that a person is experiencing the couch, but rather realize that there is experience. This is experience. And the person, the body, is part of the experience, not the experiencer, but rather the experienced. And if we take it a step further, we say there isn't the experienced, there is just experiencing. Because the experienced can, to our thinking, imply an experiencer of the experienced. So what we're saying is the person is not the experiencer, but the experienced, i.e. part of this momentary experience that is always changing. And really, if we're really present, there is just experiencing, meaning an experience happening.
There's nobody there.
That's right. There is experiencing. You have to say that there is subjectivity. In experiencing, there has to be subjectivity. But the subject is not separate from that which is experienced. And it's all-encompassing, all-pervading. So the momentary experience it's happening, but what is it that is aware of the experience? And these aren't questions to answer with our intellect, not until we know from direct experience, and then from the direct experience of what I'm pointing at, then we can put concepts onto it. We can put it into words. So this is not something it's something to be experienced. Which really means bring your attention into the present moment and realize it's a momentary experience. And that the person, the body, is part of the experience and not a separate experiencer. Had we finished, Anil? What was your question again? It was a long time ago.
The answer to the question, I guess, is I just have to wait till grace comes upon me.
Oh wait, no, but you said what are the practices?
What are the tools, right?
The tools.
By definition, if there's a tool, then then I am trying to get somewhere which
Yeah, but
you suggest I try to get off.
Well, you see, I don't want to just say to someone, oh, there's nothing you can do, right? Because it isn't entirely like that. It's like we have to see the attitude of doership and see that that's getting in the way. But just listening to, so your question, on the one hand, is, you could say invalid, but on the other hand, it's very valid. Because if you're asking me to just describe a process that can happen, which is all I ever do when I describe these things. So if it sounds like I'm telling someone as a separate doer to do it, understandable, but I'm not. They're just descriptions. And those descriptions are not being given to a doer, they're being given to a biological instrument, let's say, that can is being changed by the information. And then the biological instrument functions automatically. So it's not your doing if someone says, bring attention into the present moment. It can sound like, it can seem when it happens, oh, that I brought attention into the present moment. But from another perspective, we can see that the body-mind organism has been given new conditioning, and the movement of attention into the present moment is a happening, not the doing of an individual. It's a happening through the body-mind organism that has been designed by life to function that way. So I'm just providing information that can bring a changed movement. And the information I'm providing is inspired by your question, let's say.
No, I was just curious if there was, because some of the reading that I've done, I understand.
Is that,
some reading and some chatting, I understand there are people that it's sort of helped them when they've either paid attention to their breath or meditated, and I was just curious if those were some things it occurred to you to do once in a while or not. I was just curious. Yeah.
So those are all part of different methodologies. So all of those things, mantras, focusing on the breath, doing yoga, physical asanas, all of that is methodology, including non-duality. And some non-duality at a certain point needs to say, there's nothing for you to do, there's nowhere for you to go because your happiness is available right now. Why does it say that? It's a methodology to interfere with the thinking mind that might still be trying to get somewhere, including getting to enlightenment, getting to find the self. And if the thinking mind has taken on that task, non-duality has to come along and say, there's nowhere for you to go, and nothing for, there's no practice, no techniques. Because one, there's no one to do them, and secondly, you don't need to get anywhere. So, and it can be very powerful. But the fact is that there is a process, and so that teaching that says, there's no one there to do anything, which is different in a way to you're not the doer, right? It's not. There's subtle differences. If someone says you can't do anything, there's nothing for you to do, is a bit different to saying you're not the doer, but then describing a lot of things, describing a lot of mechanics. They're different methodologies. So there's some teachings that will just say, your question itself, you've got it all wrong. There isn't anywhere to go. You're trying to get somewhere. You're asking me, what's the methodology to get to some imaginary place? So correct that thinking. And even, you're not there to correct it even. And I'm not here telling you to correct it. this is just words happening. Who cares? Don't worry about them. Don't think about it. That's a teaching methodology that understands a certain movement of the thinking mind, and it understands how to run interference in it. And it will say there's no teacher, there's no teaching, because if it says there's a teaching and a teacher, then the thinking might say, okay, if there's a teacher, then there's a student, and the student then obviously has to learn what the teacher is teaching, and so I have to work hard and think, which can be more of the thinking mind. And so all of these things are said with a reason in mind, right? And so that teaching that says it's not a teaching is a teaching saying it's not a teaching. It's a methodology to bring about a particular change. And, Buddhism will tell you right action, right thought. Well, that's a methodology. They're all very different, and they're all completely valid. And what I'm saying is one methodology, one of those teachings. And so your question was there a tool you used? And what I've just described is a very significant, I wouldn't necessarily call it a tool, but once you're reconditioned, it might start happening. And you could call it a tool. It's okay if we call it a tool as long as we realize, well, actually it's just in a moment the thought arises, be here with this experience, as knowing it as an experience. Not just saying it's an experience, but then being here with the walls and the couch. That's not knowing it as an experience. Be here with the experience, realizing that if we really come into the presence with the experience, it's all arising in awareness. There is an awareness that seems like, on one level, to be the awareness of the person, of the body. And from a different perspective, we might say, wow, no, there's just awareness. And the whole thing is arising in awareness, and the body is just an object, like the couch and like the other people, which are really not separate. There's just this single arising. Right? So that's one of the tools.
Yeah. Lots of questions, but I'll try and make it one. When you talk about experience of one room to the next, or say from this room to the restaurant, it seems like you're talking about the physical visual experience.
That's a very big part of experience, yes.
Yes. But mostly what I find, and this connects also to the question that gentleman asked, is going back into this rabbit hole, as he calls it, of the mind. So I find, yes, I can change rooms, and I can change cities and countries or whatever, but somehow I'm still in the grips of the thinking mind. Once the visual experience, which you say is a large part of the experience, goes, and I'm back in my room or in my bathroom, and I'm like, oh my God, it's like gripped me again. And then there's a sense of frustration that I can experience new partners, new relationships, and new cities, and new foods, but somehow some old tattoos, which is the ones that I want to get rid of because they are the ones that are giving me maximum suffering. And if I didn't have them, I really wouldn't need to change partners or cities. But those are the ones that don't really budge very much. And the visual experience is beautiful, sensory, and I love it, and I can forget the thinking mind for the moment, and then it comes back. Mm-hmm. So I'm really looking to wash that tattoo out. And I'm not the doer.
Yeah. So well, you see, you have to. No one has ever been a doer. In the history of time, there's never been a doer. Right? There has always been life happening. There's just been a belief that I am the doer, right? So when we say I'm not the doer, it's true, but what we really need to see is that the belief in what I'm talking about the belief in doership is an attitude, and that attitude can come into the seeking. So we could say, what I want to get rid of is this old tattoo, right? That could be the problem in and of itself, right? Because the insistence in the body-mind organism is life needs to change from the way it is.
Yes.
Yeah. Now, so I can say that actually, you can't do it. You can't make this happen. So put your tools down.
I can't.
You see, yeah, exactly. Even that is not in your control. Right? But the reason it's said is not to give someone to be insensitive or to make someone feel even more depressed. Right? It might make someone feel even more depressed. I hope I don't do it in the way that I've seen it being done, and I don't even know that the other way is not going to be very beneficial, but it can be done in a way where there's no connection to the other person and where they're coming from, right? Where we say, there's nothing you can do, and leaves the other person hanging. So it's appropriate to point out that there's nothing you can do to some people in some circumstances, and other times it's not. But if we're looking at this exchange that we're having now, you can see where your question is coming from, right? The question is, I want to get rid of the tattoo or the residual components that keep dragging me out or keep making life so uncomfortable. Tell me how to do that. And at the core of those belief systems, that which is making life uncomfortable, do you know what's at the core of that?
I'm the doer.
Yeah, which means the belief that I and the other person are in control of making life happen a certain way. Right? That's what the uncomfortableness is. Right? That's what you're saying. I hope to be able to undo that, or let's make it passive. You're saying, I hope that can get undone. Right? That's a healthier way, right? Because if we say, this is the core of the problem is the deeply ingrained belief that I am the doer that can make life happen a certain way, right? So if the seeking is approached with the attitude, just tell me what I need to do in order to make life a certain way. Just tell me what I need to do in order to get rid of this load. Right? You might see that what is at the core of that load is the belief that I am the one that made life happen a certain way, or doership, that's the uncomfortableness. And what's presenting in the present moment is more of that, right? When we say, so how do I do it? How do I get rid of this load? And so with compassion, I'm saying, you can't, and I'm saying it so that hopefully it can be seen that, oh, I can't, like, or felt, or maybe it hits where a surrender happens. So I mean it sincerely. Dipali can't make this happen. This is not sad news, because if in this moment there is a surrendering, the words come in, and instead of the words sounding like, this is really bad news, why are you telling me this? You know, I don't want to hear that I can't make it happen. The core the problem at the core is the belief that was in place a long time ago that I can make life happen. Right? So if we hear this, I can't make life happen. I'm not making life happen. I never have been making life happen. That's the undoing of the problem. So it's ironic. It sounds like bad news. It sounds like you can't do it is an attack, in a sense, on what you're looking for. But if we register that on this outer level, instead of continually trying to make it happen, that's the beginning of the problem being undone. For as long as we keep trying to make it happen on the outer level is sort of like right now, tell me how to do it. As long as we keep trying to make it happen on the outer level, then the problem is being intensified. The core of the problem is being reinforced and intensified. So as soon as on the outer level we go, I can't do it. Like, oh, I'm not meant to do it. No one has ever done it. No one has ever, as a doer, got themselves out of suffering. The suffering ends when it dawns on us, I'm not the doer. What great news! I'm serious. Do you know, it means that you're not responsible for your life. Like when you look back on your life, you know, you're not the one that succeeded or failed, as in you as a separate doer. Doesn't that self-image we have of ourselves as a separate doer in control just never existed. It was never what was making life turn out a particular way.
I would more specifically, I wanted to ask you if the climate of the mind can change. The thoughts that come repeatedly in the mind, the quality of thoughts, can they be higher quality? Can the judgments drop?
Sure. So the quality of thoughts, or if you look at the thoughts that you're talking about, the core of those thoughts is doership. So if you judge the other, let's say, you're saying you are a separate doer that could have and should have done it better. Right? You're not living up to society's standards. You're not living up to my standards. Why not? You can function differently in this moment. That attitude is an attitude that isn't seeing the other as an instrument of life, doing exactly what life is dictating that they do, right? So that is not a great quality of thought. You know that from your own experience. It comes in and it means that instead of there being harmony with the other, there is disharmony with the other, and the disharmony is contained in that thinking process, in that set of thoughts, and in their condensed form, it's feeling, right? Even a feeling of hatred towards the other. So the judgment, it's not just on the thought level, you should be doing this differently. It can be like a feeling of hatred, judgment, blame, resentment towards the other. So you're saying, can the quality of those thoughts change? And I say, of course, it can, if the root from which those thoughts are coming gets changed, right? Meaning the root of seeing yourself and the other as the doer. Now, we want to try and change the root by maintaining the same belief on the outer level. So you can't change the root unless on the outer level, to start with, the outer level means, you have to start from the outside inwards. We can't expect to change the belief at the core from doership to seeing that there is no doer when we're trying to solve the problem from a place of doership. So that's why when it dawns on us on the outside, let me not worry about the core of the suffering for now. Let me see, if possible, that the suffering is a happening. Right? So when the judgment happens, understand that that isn't your doing in the present moment, right? You're not making that happen. It's happening. What would your explanation be to me as to why it's happening? Try and make it impersonal. An impersonal explanation of dynamics, sort of mechanics.
Why what is happening?
Why is the judgment arising? On what basis?
Can you give me an example?
Yes. So, if you see a cigarette burning, and I say, so why is the ash component getting bigger on the cigarette?
Yeah.
What's your explanation?
That's a no-brainer.
Yeah.
It's burning.
It's burning, yeah.
It's burning.
Okay.
So there's nothing personal about that.
No. So then if I say to you, why is judgment arising?
In the cigarette ash burning?
No, that was an analogy. That was something that hopefully allows us to see what I mean by, why is the ash component getting bigger? Oh, because a burning process is happening.
Yes.
Right? Why is judgment happening in this moment? Like if it was happening in a moment, why is the judgment happening? Just
Okay.
Give me a description of why it's happening.
So it's happening right now. I'm judging the talks a little bit because I somehow feel that there are a lot of words and of course I know that I have been helped by these words a lot. It's just that I'm not aware so closely because every day the conditioning breaks away a little bit, but I'm with myself all the time, so I don't know how much I've changed. But I somehow feel like I haven't. So, I mean, I'm told that things have changed and there's movement, but I somehow judge myself. And then I judge the talks.
And where does the judgment come from?
From the fact that it should be faster, or there has to be more speed, or
So who does the judging?
I'm not the doer.
No, but don't just say words. Who is doing the judging? You can just be honest from your own answer.
What do you mean?
You don't have to get the answer right.
Okay.
The right answer is the one that just is your natural answer.
It's judging just comes all the time, and I feel like it's...
Who's doing the judging?
I am.
Okay, and who's this I? Just no right answer, just your answer.
I'm me. Just the person who normally gets things done.
Mm-hmm.
I can do a lot of stuff, and this one doesn't seem to be going so fast.
Yeah.
It's too slow.
So what's the description in the teaching as to why the person functions the way they function?
Because of their genes and up-to-date conditioning.
Right. And those two factors, did you have anything to do with those?
No.
No. So who made you the way you are now?
My genes and up-to-date conditioning.
Yeah, so that's part of life, let's say.
Yes.
So life designed you to be this way.
Yeah.
Right? So who is the doer of the outputs of the person? Who can we say is responsible?
The parents?
No. But like you were just about to say, so life put the genes and up-to-date conditioning in place. The genes and up-to-date conditioning force the human to function a particular way. Right?
Yeah.
That's why we function that way, just because of these factors that we weren't in control of. Part of life. Life put them in place. So when judgment happens, why is it happening? Because of?
The way I'm conditioned.
Yes. And who's responsible for that?
Not me.
Good. Life.
Life.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
So when the judgment happens, you might be able to see it as a happening according to life.
Yeah.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
So that attitude, which is the attitude on the outer level, the attitude that is aware of the judgment happening and says, this is life doing this. Right? This is a result of not me. What does that mean? It means you have a bit of distance. You are the suffering, the judgment, is now essentially something you are aware of.
Yes.
An object happening, a thought object arising, a mental movement happening. And you are that which is aware of it. Right? You're uninvolved in it. If you can truly see that it's a result of my genes and up-to-date conditioning, life put that in place, so the suffering is life happening.
Yes.
So that is non-involvement. Right? So let's just go back. What's at the core of the problem? If we go right to the core, it's involvement. Involvement means doership and attachment to outcomes.
Yes.
So the way that that error at the very deepest part gets fixed is when a different attitude comes in on the outer level. So the attitude that is most useful is an attitude of seeing the judgment as a happening, part of the predetermined story of life, an inevitability in that moment. And once again, to the mind, this can sound like not a very good solution. It's like, well, you haven't got rid of the suffering, have you? Thanks for nothing. But the actual act of being uninvolved in the suffering is freedom from that suffering. And if that becomes the prevailing attitude towards your suffering, the attitude of non-doership is setting in on the outer level, and it will only have one way to go, which is inward. Right? This is why often it's misunderstood. It's like saying, well, if you tell someone there's nothing that they can do, that's not very helpful. But if we can understand why there's nothing we can do, why we're not the ones that have made the suffering happen, so you're not the one that's going to fix it. It's not your job to fix it. That life is doing the suffering. Let life fix it. And if that starts to be your attitude to the suffering, because normally, what's the attitude to the suffering? Involvement in the suffering, like wanting it to go away, resisting it, saying, why am I blaming? Why am I judging? I should know better by now. That's more suffering on top of the judgment. A judgment of yourself on top of the judgment of the other. So this that sounds like it's of no use, this telling someone that they're not the doer, as long as we can show the dynamics and it becomes an insight rather than just someone saying, oh, I'm not the doer. Like really, you need to know the basis on which the suffering is arising. So that's why I said, on what basis is the suffering arising? The answer, like you said, well, my genes and up-to-date conditioning. And life put the genes and up-to-date conditioning in place, so that's not my doing. That's life's doing. So let life deal with it. It's not going to be satisfying to the intellect hearing this. If a shift, if a new attitude to the suffering happens, which it could, we're having a discussion, right, about the most important components. So if tomorrow you feel judgment, a thought might come up and say, that's life happening, not my job to fix it. If that happens, and that's not you doing it, right? If you pretend that there's nothing to do about it, it won't feel like there's any peace. But if something truly sees the suffering, the judgment, as a happening, and it then automatically says, I can't fix that. I'm not capable of fixing that. Really, we aren't capable of fixing it. The freedom comes when we stop being interested in fixing it. You know, it's like someone who's obsessed with all of the domestic problems that all of the neighbors are having, right? And as soon as the neighbors have a domestic problem, they're into it, trying to break up the fight and all of this. And they're saying, the person is saying, why don't I have any peace in my life? Why don't I have any space? And the answer is because you keep going in and fighting everyone's fights. You become part of the fight. And if it really dawns on them, it's like, oh, I don't need to be involved in this person's fights and that person's fights and that person's fights and that person's fights. If it really dawns on them, then, you know, they might, as soon as they hear a fight, they get up and start running over, and then it clicks, actually, it's not my fight. And they go back home and they're, look at that. I've got my free time and my space. And so all the problem was that each time there was a fight in one of the neighboring houses, they get up and go and fight the fight. It's not your fight to have. Same with the suffering when it arises. It's arising because it's an inevitability in that moment. If something truly can understand, it's not my fight to fight the suffering. An experiential freedom will be experienced. And then when it's that experiential freedom is experienced, we start realizing this is the way. The way is to become dispassionate about certain things in life. To be uninterested in certain things. And we realize that dispassion is not unfortunate. Often when we think about being dispassionate about things in life, we think that that's very unfortunate. There are some things that when we're dispassionate about some things, it creates a freedom that we're looking for. Yes. So when I'm talking about the experience changing, I'm not talking about having a great experience that you get excited about and interested in. Right? That's not the sort of experience I'm saying. If you're sitting in your bathroom, and let's say it's a particularly old, unattractive bathroom, and it has cracks in the tiles and the sink leaks. There's nothing really special about your bathroom. When the judgment arises, maybe you become interested in the present moment experience, which includes the rather uncomfortable object of judgment in there, right? Become present with the whole experience, the visuals of the bathroom, the sounds, and awareness of the suffering as well. And be with the experience as just an impersonal experience. Because that's a movement into the place that allows us to be uninterested, uninvolved in the judgment. If we remain on the level of the thinking and don't come into the present moment and just allow the whole experience to be as it is, then we're forced to get involved in the judgment. See how that goes.
Raja, namaste. My name is Shivakumar. I'm coming from Hyderabad. I'm here for 2 days in Pune, so I did not want to miss this opportunity to be here. Right. First of all, I should bow down at the feet of Maharajji. I read him and I heard him. Rameshji, of course, again, I saw him in the videos, YouTube, and I read him. And you are the third in the Guru Parampara, so at least I thought I'll be able to see you here. So I'm so glad to be here. A few days back, came across your YouTube videos, and then the concept was very refreshing. So, but had a few doubts. I do not know how much it connects to the theme of the discussion for the day, Roger. Is it okay if I come out with something totally different than what is being discussed here till now? I mean, of course, related to your concept.
Sure, yes.
Okay. So, I come from South India, from a Brahmin family. You've grown up in the culture, and we've heard of a lot of the lives of saints, the stories. And one thing that is pretty much in our culture is the personal aspect of the God as much as the impersonal aspect. In fact, even with realized saints like Tukaram or Maharajji, we see that they indulge in bhajan, they indulge in Panduranga, giving a name and form, doing arti, stuff like that. So this is a culture. So where does the personal God aspect fit into this concept I was wondering about that. Particularly, I also, when I thought about it, I felt it's about the bhakti. Now you talk about surrender in a particular way, but I felt the bhakti, where does it fit into your whole concept? Would like to hear that. I had a few more questions, but I would be kind of, I think, robbing everybody's opportunity. I felt a little greedy because I'm here only for one more day tomorrow, but I thought I'll at least take this opportunity.
Very good. And I'd be happy to give you here for one more day. Tomorrow we can have address more of the questions. So when there's lots of reasons why we can keep doing certain rituals, even after certain realizations. So sometimes it seems strange that people will continue to, in a way, worship a deity when the realization is that they are God, in a sense, or that there is no separation. And the explanation for it is that even with that realization, the paradox of life, whereby both the relative and the absolute coexist, remains in place. So even though we can maybe come to know ourselves as more than just the physical body, come to know ourselves as the space, let's say, in which everything arises, come in contact with a part of ourself that is what would be referred to as the absolute. The human aspect, the relative aspect, doesn't suddenly end. If that realization brought about the end of the relative, then we could say, oh, well, the relative is part of the illusion, part of the misunderstanding, part of the ignorance. And so then realization means the end of the relative, the end of that, because it's part of the ignorance. But what happens is that with the realization, the relative aspect doesn't fall away. So it means that the relative is not part of ignorance. Duality on one level doesn't fall away. So when we look at the yin-yang symbol, it's symbolic in that it has duality in it, interconnected opposites, yin and yang, hard and soft. And the symbology is that the two balance each other to create a whole. So what often happens in awakenings is that, and in the teachings, is that one aspect is spoken about, the whole. And in order for the whole to be seen, we sometimes need to say that the duality doesn't exist. Because on the surface, the duality is preventing us from seeing the whole. So part of the methodology often is to denounce the duality as illusory. It's not there. Essentially, what it's doing is it's rubbing out the black and the white, which never really can get rubbed out, but through the teachings essentially can brainwash us in a healthy way to not see the black and the white for a while. And then they say, do you see that's a whole, one circular whole? It isn't two. And because the teachings have been pointing at not the black and the white and saying the black and the white is not real. So it's created the capacity for us to no longer see the black and the white, whereas it's actually still there. We can then become convinced that the black and white don't exist. But the real power of the yin-yang is to be able to come back and see that yin-yang is both the non-dual and the dual, and to hold that paradox. And so the paradox is that I know myself as God, you could say, and as the individual. And so as still knowing myself as the individual, gratitude towards Ramesh, for example, still arises. Gratitude towards life still arises, where if we say, well, there is no duality, there is no relative, that was all the illusion, then our brain can't comprehend why we would have certain feelings, because that certain feelings imply duality in them. Right? So hopefully this is an explanation that says, explains why Maharaj would continue to do certain rituals. The other explanation is he's done it for his whole life. It gives him pleasure, because pleasure and pain is still part of the flow of life. And so why stop?
What would be interesting to know, Roger, is that let us say before awakening, somebody is doing the ritual. Mm-hmm. And post-awakening, they continue to do ritual because that's their practice. Mm-hmm. Would there be a difference in attitude when they still do it?
Very much, I would say. Because if you look at the very beginning of a ritual, there's usually someone trying to get something out of the ritual. If they do it, walking around the mountain in Arunachalam, every time you walk around, you're erasing your karma. So goes the tradition. And so you see a lot of people that are walking around just in order for their karma to be erased. With a I have to do this in order to get something, and I have to do it better than anyone else. If I can be completely focused and become an expert at the ritual, then things will move even more efficiently. And that can happen in meditation. People can meditate for years trying to get somewhere, which means there's a meditator in the meditation, like someone who is judging the meditation as going well or not well. And as the process continues, which is essentially the process of moving towards liberation, it becomes clear that meditation, real meditation, happens when the meditator falls away. So we've heard Ramesh used to mention Nijinsky dances best when Nijinsky's not there. So that was Nijinsky, the ballet dancer. That was his comment, meaning, and artists know that writers and artists is once the individual that is trying to make the best painting gets out of the way, then there is just painting. Painting happens. And that's the movement of connection to the deeper part of ourself. So when an artist is in their flow, is in art, it's a gift for the artist, because it means that person has an outlet where they can, the thinking mind, the doing, trying to get something, can fall away, and then magic happens. After when someone says, that's an amazing gift you have, an amazing painting, sometimes the artists sort of know, well, actually, I can't really take that much credit for it. It sort of happens through me. Or they receive all this praise, and then the thinking mind comes in and claims ownership over what has happened, and then there's a sense of pride. And when that happens, I think the artists feel it. They know, because it feels uncomfortable. So the ritual, when the practice becomes very mature, the practice becoming mature is really where it becomes effortless and there's no practicer. And so liberation is really the liberation from this doer. And so after liberation, when the rituals are still being done, just like all of life, it's being done with a completely different attitude to where the ritual started from. It's being done with an attitude of it happening because it's part of life in this moment. No one there mentally saying, I don't want to be doing this, why am I doing this now, or am I doing it well enough, or whatever. All of that's fallen away, and there's this ritual happening. In the case of Ramesh, he promised his mother that when she was dying, I think, she wanted him, please tell me that you'll carry on with your rituals. And he loved his mother. In that moment, it seemed like that's what she wanted. So he promised, yes, I promise every morning I'll do my rituals. And he said that he continued to do his rituals because he promised his mother he would do the rituals. But I would also say that he continued to do the rituals not out of a should. I should because I promised my mother, but because the promise was seen to be something, and the love for his mother was seen to be something genuine. And so then it would have been part of his genes and up-to-date conditioning to do that, and no thinking mind saying, why did I make that promise? Or,
In fact, I have something very similar that my mother told me, and then I do Abhishekam of Shiva every morning at my home. Uh-huh. So the same thing I felt over a period of time. Initially it was a ritual, and then at times I used to feel getting late to the office, and my mother tells, but did you do it? And then, so something in me says, oh, okay, I have to do it. But of late, I've been seeing that there's a lot more love and enjoyment in the way it happens. And it just, like you said, there's from probably the impact of some working mind, I'm not too sure. There's more observation about what is happening there. At times, there's a lot of compassion. I've been a lot into music and then bhakti myself, so a lot of love I feel at that time. So these are some of the experiences. But anyway, an associated one small, if I'm not delaying, can I ask you one more question?
Yes.
Okay, associated question is about this music. I've been, from my childhood, I've been into classical music, the Carnatic classical music, which is South Indian music. Mm-hmm. You must have heard something in Tiruvannamalai, a little of that is. So I love that, and then when I'm sitting that, when I listen, I get, there is something that happens, Roger. What happens? I feel palpably in the body that kind of pulsation, which is so intensely joyful, very beautiful. It just passes as shudders throughout the life. And I see that there's no thought at that time, absolutely no thought. Many times earlier I used to think that that's the, and even when I'm not listening to that, many times I feel that, it just, I can see that it just starts somewhere and then radiates throughout the body. That sensation, the pulsation kind of thing. There's a warmth and beautiful feeling. Mm-hmm. So what's that?
What's that? You could say that it is a complex expression of the self, and in certain moments when the thinking mind falls away and we're connected to the self can manifest in more complex expressions to what I would describe as the lowest common denominator of the self. So the lowest common denominator of the self is simply being at peace, where there isn't any particular sensation that you could put your finger on. Maybe at best you would say there is a very mild sense of contentment just with being. But if you try to find it, if you try to feel it, it's not in its lowest common denominator form. It becomes much more accurate to refer to it as in its negative form, the negation of things. So that's why Buddha often referred to it in its negative form, the absence of suffering. But that true self can express in more complex forms, gratitude, joy, or the agape is this unconditional love. So when that happens, you can feel almost like a sensation in the body. Maybe it's not the physical body, but one of the other subtle bodies. And that's beautiful. It really is a sign of the mystery of what we are. And it can arise such that it is in an unconditional love form is what it feels like. It's unconditional love. And I would say that because we are more impressed with feelings, the lowest common denominator, just the peace, the absence of suffering, tends to go unnoticed and unappreciated. But then when we have these feelings come in, and we know it to be not our normal state and actually sense it to be very profound.
I think in a day or two before you expressed it as a contrast effect or something like that. You mentioned it as
especially
a contrast.
when there's been suffering before. But even if there's no suffering, but when it's one of the more complex expressions of self, it comes in as a sort of as something added, like a feeling. Then we get interested in that, and because there is this intuition that this is part of the self, then we say, oh, well, liberation is said to be Satchit Ananda, and Ananda is translated as bliss. When we look at Ananda in its transcendental form, as it's used traditionally in Sanskrit, I've heard a dissertation from a physicist that was not just a physicist, but seemed like a very complete understanding and was familiar with Sanskrit. He said actually Ananda is not the right, or bliss is not the right translation for the word Ananda. Peace is much, much closer in its transcendental form. And so Ramesh would say this notion that Satchit Ananda, and that Ananda is the result, and when it's translated, is one of the big obstacles in a way in spirituality. And he said it should be Satchit Shanti instead of Satchit Ananda. So when these more complex versions of it come up, which you could then say are bliss, let's say, we get to enjoy it, but hopefully we don't make the mistake which can be so easily made when we sense that this is a profound sense of who I am, this feeling and this vibration, that is what will be delivered on a continuous, unbroken basis in liberation. Now, maybe there are deeper and deeper expressions of liberation. I mean, in this teaching, what it says is the liberation that we're looking for, that we're really looking for, is simply the liberation from suffering, peace of mind. And my experience is when that's delivered, honestly, I'd say I couldn't care less whether whether a deeper form of liberation exists. If it comes, it comes. But what I would maintain is what we're really looking for is the freedom from suffering. And if there are any other forms of liberation beyond that, there's something very certain to me that I don't think that they would be available unless the liberation from suffering on a continuous basis has first set in. It would make sense that if there are more complex and more different forms of enlightenment, they have to build from, let's say, a basic form of enlightenment. I'm not really saying that there is a different these different forms of enlightenment, because it makes it sound like, oh, the basic form of enlightenment, peace, well, that's not so special. I tell you, I couldn't care less about any more complex forms of liberation. So experientially, when the end of suffering becomes a standard, there is this undoubtedness that says, oh, what I've always ever been looking for is nothing more and nothing less than peace of mind, the absence of suffering.
Fantastic. While you were saying, just to wind it up, I was reminded of that one line in Bhagavad Gita. It says, Jnanat Shantiranantaram. This the Shanti that comes after wisdom.
Right.
Maybe it's like the peace that passeth understanding. Maybe it's akin to that.
Yes.
Yeah.
But that peace to me is the one that I'm referring to as the lowest common denominator. Right? And Ramesh used to call it Sukha Shanti. Happiness through peace of mind.
Thanks so much. Thank you.